It's cold in here. There must be some Kislev in the atmosphere, and there will be plenty more to talk about when it comes to the Kingdom of the Bear soon, but for today, I want to focus on the story arc and narrative of Total War Warhammer 3. In particular, this reference we have to an ailing deity, and what role he or she might play in the Immortal Empires campaign coming sometime later this year. Just as a quick refresher, this is the excerpt we have from Creative Assembly referencing the story. Embarking on a new grand campaign, you'll be tasked with saving or exploiting the power of a dying god. Each race offers a unique journey through the nightmarish chaos realm, culminating in an endgame that will determine the fate of the world. So there's some divine being whose life is on the line in Warhammer 3, and it'll be up to the player to decide if their power should be used and abused, or saved to continue keeping the darkness at bay. Who that divine being will be is the question I want to discuss in this video. This is, of course, not the first time we've seen an avatar at the tail end of their immortal coil in Warhammer Fantasy. We saw Throt the Unclean grind Ariel the Mage Queen into pixie dust and snort her up his butthole for magical powers, and we saw a bunch of gods get snuffed out of existence during the end times. We know that these deities can interact with each other in the Immaterium. Of course, there's the story of Tzeentch, once the preeminent deity in the Runas pantheon, being cast down from his crystal sanctuary by Khorne and shattering into a million pieces, spreading magic and spells throughout the world. And Nurgle took Shalia captive and turned her into the Pox Fulcrum, using her immortal flesh to test the virulence of his diseases. So gods can kill gods, and gods can interact with gods, even across pantheons. This is not a new thing, but it is likely to lead us into a story never told before. Might share a few similarities with particular end times narratives, but I feel fairly confident in saying we'll be getting a brand new story here, one never touched before. I think we need to be clear right off the bat, though, that this dying god is not going to be anyone from the Ruinous Pantheon. It would make absolutely zero sense for Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh to finally show up for the first time as the preeminent and most dire threats on planet Warhammer, something we've been waiting for the better part of 5 years now, and then immediately be on death's doorstep the second they make landfall. Like, imagine building up the threat of Darth Vader for 2 full movies, never seeing him on screen, and then in his very first scene in Return of the Jedi, he steps in a puddle of toilet water and gets electrocuted half to death. That would be pretty silly. Not a good way to handle your main villains. It'd be the most anticlimactic and illogical storytelling in history. It would severely undermine the imminent danger Chaos poses on the eve of their cataclysmic invasion. So yeah, none of the Chaos Gods are going to be dying on day one. And as the Runas Pantheon is much more likely to work their magic on the exploitation side rather than the saving side of this narrative, I think it's a fair conclusion that this dying god will be from an Order race and likely human as well. Now at that point, it'd be logical to think, okay, has to either be a Kislevite or a Cathayan god then, as those are the 2 playable human and Order races launching in Game 3. But there are some issues with that. We know almost nothing about the Cathayan Pantheon and their worship. We know that there is a celestial dragon emperor, widely considered to be immortal, who rules over these distant lands, and there's some indication that he could be a god, or at the very least an avatar of one, but as he is almost certainly going to be a legendary lord and faction leader for Cathay, making him the dying god would be a very strange design choice. And when it comes to the rest of the Cathayan Pantheon, we don't know a goddamn thing. Really, the only other deity tied to their lore, outside the possibility of the Dragon Emperor, is Tzeentch, who has spread his corrupted tendrils throughout certain elements of the Cathayan Empire. But worship of the Changer of Ways is certainly not fully sanctioned in their civilization, and there will likely be some very serious civil wars and anti-corruption work to purge his influences from the inner courts when you're playing. It's very possible G-Dubs and CA will work together to create some new Cathayan gods for Game 3, but I have a hard time believing a major plot point that drives the entire narrative of a combined trilogy will hinge on some random minor deity no one has ever heard of before. If they're just being introduced for the first time, having them be the central focal point of the entire narrative is a weird design decision, which is exactly why I think it's safe to rule out many of the minor Kislevite gods as well. Not that they're physically incapable of carrying the campaign with their struggle, I just think it's going to be more difficult for players to empathize with or care about someone like Tor or Aryanka, because most of you are rightfully saying,
who the fuck is that guy? Who the fuck is that?
There have been some decent arguments here and there and there are some lore snippets that are worth covering that might hint at a major role for these minor gods, but ultimately, I think they're a bit of a stretch, and I think there are better options to carry the torch. The first is Aryanka, a goddess of law, staunchly opposed to the forces of chaos. Sometime in the distant past, we don't know exactly when, Aryanka was confronted by the dark gods and was defeated, laid to rest in a crystal coffin somewhere in the old world. Very few have ever been to or seen her resting place, but the most recent rumor puts her in the bowels of Prague, a city that's kind of been on the front line in the war against chaos and has a long and illustrious history of being pooped on by the dark gods. And there have long been rumors that Prague is victimized by these attacks so frequently, even after the Great War some 250 years prior, precisely because of what lies beneath the city. And if you look at her artwork, she essentially looks like the Ice Queen, so pretty clearly Kislevite inspired. She honestly fits many of the criteria you might look for in this dying god, but Games Workshop don't even own her rights as part of their IP anymore, which is why we're probably not going to be seeing her or Malal in Game 3, both of which are characters that have been quietly discarded from canon. They're really not going to play a part in this campaign at all. On the other hand, there's Daz, the Kislevite god of fire and sun. This handsome deity is eternally wreathed in flame, bringing hospitality and warmth to the northern reaches and shielding against the darkness that would consume the kingdom of the bear. A light in the darkness, essentially, to hold back the encroaching tides of chaos. It's certainly something both sides of this conflict would want to manipulate to their own ends. We've seen flame manipulated in the Warhammer narrative before. Teclis and the Flame of Ulrich immediately come to mind, of course, and that's not even the biggest hint in his favor, that he'd be this light in the darkness against all these bad guys coming in from the north. If you take a listen to the opening song in the Warhammer 3 cinematic trailer, death is like the winter chill, no door can keep it from us, and summer yet may bloom again, though ice be all upon us. That is a stanza dedicated to Daz. That is the Oblast Fireside song that refers to hospitality, guests, and keeping your neighbor safe and warm with winter encroaching. So when we're talking about all this in the context of a dying god, think of a flame sputtering in the wind, a fire that's no longer providing all the light and warmth it should be, as the god calling of chaos approaches. It certainly fits the criteria we're looking for. The problem with Daz is that even the most hardcore of Warhammer Fantasy fans probably haven't heard of him before. I'd venture to guess maybe 0.1% of the total population of people who have played this trilogy have ever heard of Daz. He's a super minor god in a minor faction. Does it make sense to have a deity very few of us have ever heard of before be the central focus of the narrative? I certainly think it can work. He might even be one of the frontrunners, but it is a major question. Of course, the other Kislevite option here is Ursun the Bear God, the strength, wisdom, and backbone of this entire kingdom. We know that Tsar Boris is conspicuously absent, and that he and his companion Erskine, the bear, disappeared in their fight against chaos sometime just before the beginning of Warhammer 3's campaign, and that he only paused to send a letter to his daughter before they were completely overrun. We know that the Ice Queen Tsarina Katerin plunged into the Chaos Waste, searching for what is lost, presumably to fix whatever has befallen this dying god and perhaps to find and save her father as well. We know that Boris Boka's disappearance could serve as an allegory for Ursun's conflict with chaos, and we know that Boris is the only logical character to play that role as an avatar of sorts, or at the very least, a representative of this bear god. More than that, Ursun actually has the name recognition, power, and fleshed out lore to potentially carry a narrative as large as Warhammer 3's. It's entirely possible that the search for Boris will play a major role in Warhammer 3's campaign, and that other factions would be interested in ensuring Ursun's survival, because the death of Kislev would mean the death of the Empire and a cascade effect that would soon see the entirety of the old world in flames, an effect that would also severely weaken the western border of Cathay. Without that frigid bastion in the center of everything on the front lines against the Dark Gods, all the other human empires are in for a wild ride once Kislev is dead and gone. So Cathay and the Empire would have a vested interest in keeping the most important religious figure in Kislev alive. But this is ultimately where the idea of a dying god begins to start breaking down, with the examples we've given so far. Because up to this point, there's no deity that truly represents multiple human factions, that is actively worshipped across racial lines. I believe the God of the Dead might be the answer to that question. This is a powerful being venerated in many Warhammer cultures under different names. To the Empire, he is known as Mor. To the Tomb Kings, he is known as Usirian, Lord of the Underworld. But all civilizations recognize that he is the Shepherd of the Dead, he who safeguards and escorts souls into oblivion. Without the safety net provided by him, many of these souls could find themselves enslaved to the will of the Dark Gods, swelling their ranks and power ever onwards. Mor guards these souls of the departed from the predations of chaos and necromancers, who would seek to corrupt and abuse them, just as he safeguards dreams from demons who would try and pervert them. So Mor is pretty staunchly anti-chaos. It is likely that every civilization on the planet worships him in one way or another, because all need a shepherd to safeguard the souls of their dead, and his destruction would affect every other race in a tangible way. In the end times, Nagash tears Shaiish, the Wind of Death, from the Great Vortex, consuming Mor in the process. He's referred to as Usirian during this part of the story, but it becomes clear that Usirian, the Nehakaran god of the underworld, and Mor, god of the dead, are one and the same. So a weakened Mor at the start of Warhammer 3's campaign doesn't just set up a narrative that any civilization has a vested interest in protecting, it also lays the groundwork for the return of Bone Daddy Nagash, creating a three-way war between order, death, and chaos, which leads me to conclude that the God of the Dead might be dying his own death when Warhammer 3 comes out, perhaps struck a mortal blow by the combined might of the Chaos Gods. So, in my opinion, the dying god at the heart of Warhammer 3's narrative is a toss-up between Daz, Ursun, and Mor. Daz is a super minor god that very few of us have ever heard of before, and so from that standpoint, it's kind of weird to put him at the center of everything. But that's actually maybe a benefit for choosing him, that he can be killed off in a way that raises the stakes, but ultimately doesn't really raise the stakes in any meaningful way because he's not that important. Like, you wouldn't have Sigmar dying here. He's too big a deal, right? So if you choose a no-name god, people can still think, oh wow, their deity's dying, this is a huge problem. But you don't truly mess up the equilibrium of the setting by killing someone like Daz off. And he was hinted at very clearly in the announcement cinematic, although that could have just been a stanza Creative Assembly felt fit the theme of the trailer well, which, to be fair, it did, and that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be in the game. I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that Ursun or Mor could be in as the dying god as well. Both are comparatively major gods when standing next to Daz. Most people invested in this trilogy have heard of them before, and so could probably empathize and care more if they were the ones dying, and they're more likely choices when it comes to factions like the Empire or Cathay also caring too. If those two deities are on the chopping block, then the other human civilizations are a lot more likely to jump in and say, oh god, we gotta do something because Kislev, if they lose Ursun, they're boned, period. So I'm gonna lay down the gauntlet right now and say that I think Ursun will be the dying god in Warhammer 3's campaign, because I think a missing in action Tsar Boris is too big a coincidence to ignore. I think the reason someone like the Ice Queen has for plunging into the realms of chaos is to save her father and the most important deity in the Kislevite pantheon. A dying Ursun raises the stakes enormously in this campaign, not just for Kislev, but for the Empire and Cathay as well, who would prefer to not be on the front lines when the Chaos Cataclysm comes knocking. I think there's good arguments to be made for Daz and Mor as well. I would not be surprised if either of those end up being the final choice, but for now, until we know more, my bet is on Ursun the Bear God, and I think he is a logical pick. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, and I will see you all in the next video.